o'clock hour begins, and Ralph Russo, Associated Press, joins us. He had some pieces up on social media about the poll that was released earlier today, and he joins Paul. Catalina is out today. He's at possibly jury duty, being selection process. Craig Smoak with me, and I'm David Smoak. Ralph, thank you very much. Was there anything, and man, I saw and heard some of your nuggets, but was there anything in particular when you glanced at it that jumped out at you the most?
Yeah, it's funny. Nothing really tends to surprise me in the polls because, and part of it is because I've been watching it get put together over the last month or so, and I've been staring at it, trying to make sure there are no mistakes and things along those lines. So at a certain point, it becomes, you sort of like lose the surprise factor, and also doing it for 20 years too. I would say, I think Alabama being number 4 is somewhat notable just because it's notable to me because I think it's another way of showing how great Saban has been, right? This is the lowest preseason ranking for Alabama since 2009, right? They've been at least in the top 3 every year since then. And by the way, that year they were number 5 and won the national championship. So, only in Alabama is number 4, a reason for concern, right? So that's maybe one thing. Listen, it's always interesting coming into this season since realignment is on our mind so much. Pac-12's got 5 ranked teams, all in the top, I think 17 or 18. I think 18 is the lowest in Oregon State. And it just sort of makes you go like, wow, this is going to be a great year for the Pac-12, and it also might be the last year for the Pac-12. Mm-hmm. That's kind of an odd storyline to see that they finally sort of have a lot of their programs clicking, and now the conference is about to fall apart. So I think those are a couple of things. And listen, you can't help but notice, a team like Florida State's in the top 10 for the first time in about 5 or 6 years, and so welcome back, Knowles, and we'll see how well they hold up to the scrutiny in a year where they're, again, are the nose finally back, and do they have a real championship possibility of, a team that has the possibility of winning a championship.
And a nice 5 versus 8 matchup that we'll get right away with LSU and FSU. So that'll be a lot of fun. Hopefully it's as exciting as last year's game was. But, Ralph, in general, you touched on realignment. And, not only do you see, hey, all these schools are leaving from the Pac to the Big Ten, but now it's from the Pac to the Big 12. It's from the Big 12 to the SEC and so on and so forth. And of course, there's all sorts of other things, still swirling out there. But just as a longtime college football reporter, what has been kind of your 2 cents take on everything that you've seen unfolding over these last few weeks and months and I guess couple of years now?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's great for the sport as a whole. I think as I wrote a couple of weeks ago, it's not really realignment. It's more like consolidation. And I think that the sport is sort of narrowing a little bit to focus more and more on the top brands. And, it worked out okay for the Big 12 this time around. But, as I sort of wrote, I wouldn't get comfortable because at some point the bell will toll for you. If it keeps along this trajectory, if we just keep adding, if we keep narrowing the focus and saying, no, the big brands, we have to get them all under 110. We have to get them all under 110. At some point that sounds fatalistic that we're heading towards Super League and there's going to be 35 teams and it's going to look like maybe the NFL. It sounds fatalistic, but it is exactly the trajectory, right? We don't have, that doesn't have to continue to be the trajectory, but that is the trajectory. So I don't necessarily love it. I like the idea. But I also concede that I'm 53 years old. I grew up on the East Coast loving all of college football because there was no college football directly near me, right? So I love the West, the width and breadth of college football, right? Because I had no allegiance because it was not a lot in the New York area. So the idea that you had all these outposts in far off reaches of the country and there was college football everywhere that was kind of meaningful was what drew me into it. I don't care about the SEC or the Big Ten. I never had an allegiance to a conference. So when you start whittling the things down and consolidating a little bit, and all the attention comes on a few conferences, and like, to me, that is losing a little bit of what we like about college football.
Ralph, how often, and I'm not asking you to name names, but how often do you get the top 25 votes as they come in, especially the preseason one, and you're like, was this person paying attention?
No, I tell you, very rarely. And the big reason why, first of all, I think our voters do a really good job. And I think they're very diligent. The other reason why is, like, I look at this very differently than fans. Like, fans have a very low tolerance for anything that doesn't jive with their fandom, right? I was talking to Reese Davis, name drop, earlier today for my podcast. And, Reese had the gall to vote Michigan #1 and Georgia #2. And so Georgia fans are just like, my God, like, you might as well have dedicated on my lawn. Like, right? Like, so, like, to me, like, something that's a little out of the box, or a little bit like, oh, that's, that I don't agree with that, but I could see that. Like, that's where I come from. Like, there's a whole bunch of votes that I don't agree with.
Sure.
And even from week to week, and there will truly be from week to week, where I will look at the votes and be like, man, I wish the voters didn't do that. Like, that just doesn't jive to me. But I don't look at that, but very, very, like, I can't think of any, but almost never will I look at it and go, well, that's just ridiculous. Because my bar for what ridiculous is, I like to see voters sort of think a little outside the box, and have a very high tolerance for what is considered ridiculous, where fans do not, because fans are kind of set into what they believe, and they're driven by a little more emotional than I am. To me, hey man, as long as you're not voting for, like, as long as you're not, like, showing some kind of extreme bias or voting for a bunch of losing teams and not paying attention to the scores, I'm usually pretty cool, because I don't want to influence votes.
Ralph, Texas is a lightning rod every year, and I definitely feel like there's some years where there's maybe just who do I need at 23, 20? Oh, let's throw Texas in there. I just, it's a brand and people know it, but they're all the way up at 11 to start off this year. And we've been talking about them quite a bit. And I think most of us are in agreement on this show and listener wise that Texas is deserving of being a favorite. But just outside that top 10, I mean, that means that they're really cooking right now. Do you agree with that sentiment about Sarkisian and where this Longhorns program is heading at the moment?
I mean, so this becomes a little bit about emotional, and then look at the data. Like, if you look at what Texas brings back and the returning production and how they played last year, and the fact that they probably played better than an 8-win team last year, right? If you look at the analytics, like, you can see this is probably a team that's sort of built to take a big jump forward this year. However, yeah, like, as a person who has followed this and the whole Texas is back, narrative over the last 10 years, I find myself, and just to be clear for your listeners, I don't vote, right? We just count them up. We just count up the ballot here. I don't have a ballot, at least not an official one. So, like, me personally, I look at Texas at number 11 and find myself going, if I had a ballot, I might make the Longhorns prove it a little more. Like, I see what you see. I see that really good offensive line with some of those young guys from last year. I see all those receivers. I see a 5-star quarterback who could take a big leap forward. Like, I see it, but I might want to be a little more skeptical, just because because after 10 years of a time seeing it, I would like to see it before I back it.
Texas Tech, South Carolina, UCLA, and UTSA with Jeff Traylor were the highest, closest to not making the top 25, but they were right on the cusp. Which of those 4 teams surprised you that weren't?
Which of those didn't get in that I thought maybe could? I thought Texas Tech, because there's been a lot of buzz on Texas Tech. Now, I guess, like, I'm not here to validate that or to poo-poo that. Like, I'm just saying that, like, they seem to be the team that people, when you sort of ask around, especially in the Big 12 country, ask around, like, who do you think could be this year's TCU, right? Like, not picked to finish to win the conference, but maybe rises up. There seems to be a fair amount of buzz around Texas Tech. Maybe it would be actually better compared to Kansas State, because I felt like Kansas State, even more so than TCU, Kansas State I felt like was that team last year. I felt like Kansas State was that team that was, outside the top 2 or 3 in terms of preseason polls, within the Big 12. But a lot of people, quite frankly, and I'll pat myself on my back, including myself, said that Kansas State could win that conference last year. And I feel like that's where Texas Tech is. Getting a lot of attention, look like they're ready to take a step forward, have a pretty conducive schedule. I could absolutely have seen them or UTSA moving up to the AAC as the team that could have slipped into the rankings. In fact, I was almost anticipating Texas Tech being ranked, and they just missed.
Yeah, good call on both those teams, Ralph. UTSA, absolutely a bust on their own right, but there is a lot of hype around Texas Tech, that is for sure. We were having a little bit of a conversation earlier about Tulane. They're right there inside at number 24, had a great season last year with the big Cotton Bowl victory. Michael Pratt's back, Willie Fritz, all that good stuff. Is 24 just like, hey, we need to acknowledge them, or do you think that's actually about right?
So, listen, I hate to speak for the voters, but
sure,
in my mind, that is a bit of like, hey, listen, this team was really good last year. We just last seen beating USC, right? So I think that once you get into the 20s, as someone who doesn't have a ballot but talks to a lot of voters, you find yourself going like, man, the difference between this team and that team, where am I going to go here? So I do think there is a little bit of a hat tip to a Tulane team that was really good last year, brings their quarterback and their coach back and a lot of pieces from that team. I would also say this, and this is where, my experience from following this sport, it is really hard to have a magical season 2 years in a row. And for programs like Tulane that are not built to sustain that type of high-level success, I would imagine that there's going to be some fairly significant regression. Now, I will say the other thing on the other hand, for Tulane, most of the best teams in that conference are no longer in that conference. So I think they're probably in good position to follow up, to have a pretty good encore season. Though I would tend to lean towards, hey man, we got to acknowledge Tulane, and once you get toward the end of the poll, you're sort of scraping around anyway.
Ralph, I know you've given us a lot of time. One other thing on the Rose Bowl, with what's happening with the Pac-12, and now it's 4, and it's falling apart, and maybe they'll survive. Every 3 years, I think they're guaranteed to be a semifinal game, and that was the new deal they finally agreed to because they were pretty stubborn. What happens if the Pac-12 falls apart on the years they don't host a semifinal game in the Rose Bowl?
Okay, so just a couple of things to clarify.
Okay.
Beyond the next 2 years, nothing is set.
Okay.
So we're riding out this contract, right? The contract that's already in place, and this coming season, the Rose Bowl is a semifinal. The next 2 years, it would be part of the quarterfinal mix. The Rose Bowl is going to be part of the quarterfinal mix. That's okay. That's okay with the Rose Bowl. I think the other thing is you have to decouple here, and I understand why people might not realize this. The changes of the playoff have already changed the Rose Bowl, right? The Rose Bowl was already headed for, you're going to be part of the playoff mix. We're not going to do traditional Rose Bowls anymore. The playoff already killed the tradition. The playoff changes, the 12-team format has already sort of signaled the death knell to the traditional Rose Bowl, regardless of what was going to happen to the Pac-12. There may have been a situation where, if we have the ability to get a Pac-12 and a Big Ten team into a quarterfinal, which the Rose Bowl is hosting, that's great. Let's do that. If we can get Pac-12 teams into the Rose Bowl the year that the Rose Bowl is a quarterfinal, they would like to do that. But the Pac-12 status and the traditional Rose Bowl thing, that basically died, or the traditional Rose Bowl thing basically died with the 12-team playoff.
Okay. I just wanted to clarify that. I was curious because a lot of people with that incredible relationship with the Big Ten and obviously the Pac-12 and how that changes. So it was changing no matter what happened with USC and UCLA. Ralph, appreciate
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Appreciate your knowledge and the insight of combing through all that, and it's really interesting. I love the fact that the polls come out. That means we're really close to maybe games, right? And then we can start talking about that, although the realignment ticker will always be kind of moving throughout the next several months.
Guys, I can't wait to start talking more about football and watching football and getting this realignment stuff in the rearview mirror. And yeah, as far as I'm concerned, when the poll comes out, unofficial starts the season. We're really looking forward to seeing how it plays out.
Thank you, sir, for what you do. Ralph Russo, Associated Press, great at what he does, and we appreciate his time. A lot of you had questions about it and wanted to get clarifications. Before